Okay. All right, we have a large number in and more coming, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Everybody, thank you for joining us today. We do have a guest speaker, Dr. John Jones, DO. Dr. Jones is currently retired from William Carey University, where he was chair of the OPP department. He was actually my chair when I was a student there. He's also a past president of the AAO, probably a bunch of other things that I'm forgetting, and has been a good friend and mentor to me. And he is co-author of a couple of chapters in the Foundations of Osteopathic Medicine textbook, which is the required reading for the students. And Dr. Jones, just thank you for being here today, and I look forward to the presentation. You have students and faculty and staff on the call.
Thank you, Dr. Lynch. And I'd also like to thank Dr. McLean for this opportunity. I remember Dr. Lynch well as a student and as my physician. Once he graduated and went through his residency, he became my physician, and there's nothing that brings more joy to a professor's heart than to raise up the next generation to where you trust them to take care of yourself and your family. And I know all of you will be the type of physician that can be trusted that way. I'm going to go ahead and open the presentation. And I guess I have to, there we go. So this is the history of the osteopathic medical profession, and I'm going to touch on many things. I know that your dean did touch on a number of things. He talked about the military, he talked about the minorities in the profession, and how we're being much more inclusive than in days past. He gave some basic thoughts, but there was very little actually about Andrew Taylor Still, who was the man who founded the profession. So actually, I have a few objectives. One is that on a written examination, should Dr. Lynch choose to give you some questions, you'd be able to identify the answers of the posted questions regarding A.T. Still and the founding of the osteopathic medical profession. There are about 22 facts, and Dr. Lynch will have those for you. And the other thing is that you're simply able to discuss A.T. Still and the founding of the osteopathic medical profession with the public and with clinical rotation preceptors based on this presentation. That's partly because you're going to have a lot of MD preceptors, and a number of them from time to time ask questions about these things, as well as the public. The reading is from Foundations of Osteopathic Medicine. It's from a chapter that I wrote based on work with Barbara Peterson, and also the PDF that Dr. Lynch will have for you. In 1892, one reform-minded MD founded the osteopathic medical profession. That was Andrew Taylor Still, who was an MD, became the first DO, and this man has cast a long shadow. Let's look at this. From one doctor to about 128,000, because this year we have about 128,000 American osteopathic physicians. In 2019, when they looked at the stats, because we don't have all the stats from 2020, 66% of DOs were less than 45 years old. That's a young profession in that way. 41% were female, and 73% of those were less than 45 years old. We have 38 colleges, 58 sites, 33 states. We've had 300% growth in the profession the past 3 decades, 63% growth since 2010. 1 out of 4 medical students in the U.S., 6 out of 10 DOs have trained or are training in ACGME residency program. Now, I'm not going to just read the slides as we go through. I'm going to have to get out of presentation mode here so that I can put up a link for you. And that is the link to the AOA statistics. You'll get a copy of this PowerPoint as well. But basically, we have if I can get into here and share this. And actually, that's not working. Here we go. Should be able to type that in. This is a new technology to me, but I find it fascinating. All right. So if you want to go there, you can actually download a report on everything that's been going on with the profession in 2019, or what, at least what they found they could cover. Okay. So basically what I need to know is whether or not we are back to the presentation now, and whether that is actually sharing, because that's what's on my screen. So Dr.
We are.
Lynch, are you able to see it?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Okay, good. So that link is just so that you can look at some of the stats if you want to, and you can download the report. If you scroll down, you find the report is easily downloadable. Now let's take a look at Still's life. He was born in 1828. He grew up, he served as a physician with his father before the Civil War. In 1861 to 1864, he was an officer in the Kansas militia. But it wasn't until 1874, about 10 years later, that he said, I flung the banner of osteopathy to the breeze. And it wasn't until 1892 that he founded the American School of Osteopathy in Kirksville. Now that's ATSU KCOM. 1896, Vermont became the first state to license the practice of osteopathy. 1917, Still died. 1973, Mississippi became the last state to license osteopathy. Who was this man? What were his antecedents? Well, his parents were the Reverend Abram and Martha Still. You can tell by looking at Reverend Still's picture what a kind-hearted man he is simply by looking at those gentle eyes. And of course, I'm joking. They look pretty intense, don't they? But the reason they look so intense actually was because this was a daguerreotype. When they took the original photographs, when photography was first developed before the Civil War, and even when I was young, the cameras were slow. So they would tell everybody, open your eyes wide and hold them open as long as you can. So they got these very intense looks from people. But he was a Methodist preacher, so he probably was pretty intense. Now, Dr. Still, Andrew Taylor Still, was born in a log cabin in Virginia, and they still have this marker there where he was born. This is the very log cabin that was on site at the time that he was born in. And he grew up as a pioneer. He was a hunter. He grew corn and other crops. He learned anatomy by butchering the animals. He killed panthers, rattlesnakes, bear, and deer. And his way of learning medicine was by the apprenticeship system, where he read the books, discussed them with his father, who was a registered physician, and then went out with him on calls and possibly with other doctors, and learned medicine by doing it. Now, that sounds a little strange. It sounds like, well, shouldn't he have had 2 years in school? Actually, most medical schools didn't go for 2 years in those days. They went for 1. If you wanted a second year, you came back and just repeated the first one. They were lectures. They didn't see patients. Okay. And then after doing the course of lectures, you went out and saw patients on your own without any training. Now, when you think about the way Dr. Still did it, instead of attending that school, he did attend one briefly in Kansas City for a period of time. But when you think about that in light of today's education, you spend 2 years in the classes and then 2 years following the doctors. Still actually did them simultaneously. He read the books and went out with his father and saw the patients. So it wasn't all that different in a way. When he was about 10 years old, he had a headache. And he said this was his first use of osteopathy when he thought back to the principles. He found that he had a headache at the base of the skull, so he laid down on a rope swing. He put his jacket over the rope and laid down and actually put his neck in slight traction. And when he did that, he went to sleep for about 20 minutes. He woke up and the headache was gone. So this made him think about the fact that if you stretched the muscles out, they would relax. Now, his maternal grandparents were actually killed by the Shawnee Native Americans. He was the third son in his family. They moved from Jonesville, Virginia to Missouri. Missouri was a hotbed of people who believed in slavery and people who did not. And his father, who was a minister, was absolutely an abolitionist. And so what he did was he basically sided with the branch of the church that went with the northern opinion. And as a result, he was no longer welcome to be preaching in Missouri. So he moved to Kansas, and he moved over to the Wakarusa Mission, which was on a Native American reservation for the Shawnee of all people. And when he was going to do that, his wife was horrified. Abram's wife was horrified. And then she came through prayer to accepting that after all, they were going out to reach the very people that had killed her grandparents. And if they had known a better way, they would not have been killing her grandparents. Of course, if the settlers hadn't been taking the land from them, the Shawnee might have been much more peaceful as well, when we look at it from today's point of view. Okay, so this was about 1851 that Still's father went out to Kansas. Still himself joined a year later. He joined because he was growing corn, and it was absolutely destroyed in a freak hailstorm that destroyed his crops, and almost nobody's around him. So he took it as a sign, moved out. His father wanted him to join him there and practice taking care of the Shawnee and the other settlers, and so that's what he did. He lost his first wife in 1860 following the birth of a child who also died. So there he was, a widower with 3 children, and he married fairly rapidly to Mary Elvira Turner, a school teacher. Now, this woman had a father who was a physician, and she had learned to mix up some of the prescriptions for him, because in those days, doctors carried a lot of their medications with them. So basically, he wound up marrying her rather quickly. She made a quick adaptation. She supported him through an extraordinary life that was extremely difficult. Now, this was the age of heroic medicine. Benjamin Rush was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was the only doctor who did. His favorite saying was, "Desperate diseases require desperate remedies." And so what they'd used in those days when Still was starting out his training was bleeding, leeches, purging, and puking. They gave people toxins to make them throw up and give them diarrhea to clear out whatever was making them sick. Calomel was one of the primary medications that was used. It was a mercuric salt compound, and they used it on people until their teeth started loosening, and some of them actually had some of their teeth falling out because what they were giving them was mercuric poisoning. This also affected their mentation. It probably shortened their lives. It absolutely killed a great many people. Now, they had morphine. That was one of the very few medications that they had. They had no antiseptics. They didn't know about antisepsis. They didn't know about that till the 1870s. And so when he was doing his training, it was very different. This, by the way, is the Wakarusa Mission, where he said he treated a lot of the Native Americans. They had had a plague that came through, and when a good number of them died, they buried them, I think, above ground on platforms, and still obtained permission to dissect some of them. This was the dissection that he got to do in order to study the anatomy, and of course the chief had given him permission to do this. By the way, are you still happy to be in med school? Now that you're in that second semester, it's a little harder, isn't it? But as you know now, happiness is currently irrelevant, okay? Young adult life. When Still was a young adult, he practiced medicine with his father and as a solo practitioner. Now, as an abolitionist, he was friends with John Brown and Jim Lane. Jim Lane was a militia leader. John Brown was the abolitionist. Maybe some of you have seen the Harper's Ferry famous painting of John Brown looking like an absolute wild man against slavery, who led a revolution there and destroyed an arsenal, and it was a very famous event. Still also became a state legislator in Kansas, and because things were so violent, it was amazing. There was a point in time where he said, when there were some insults given to the people who were opposed to slavery, he said, almost everybody in the entire legislature was, because they were frontiersmen, was carrying a pistol. Many were carrying 2, and when these insults were given, all of a sudden, all of them drew their pistols and were facing each other down. And thank God the man apologized, but it seems like in Washington, many things haven't changed, except it's other people coming into the Capitol now, and thank God they weren't coming in with weapons. Okay, so Still had quite a few adventures. I would like to actually read one adventure to you that he had, because people forget. They called it Bloody Kansas. It was really a violent time. So he says, a few months after the mule and footlog adventure, I was called to visit a sick lady named Jones, about 10 miles from my home. And in order to make the trip to and from short as possible, I took crosscuts, some of which led through the woods. On this particular occasion, by going through a thick body of timber, I could save about 2 miles. Entering the timber, I followed a path at full gallop. All at once, my mule began to slack up, and threw her ears forward, walked carefully and very reluctantly, by which I knew that men were close. Knowing that the blood of the opposition was up to a fever heat, I brought my revolver's front in my belt, unslung my sharpshooter, and prepared for any emergency. So he has 3 guns ready. Not knowing the exact position or the number of the enemy, I concluded that the best plan was to be safe, prepare to be dangerous. In a minute's time, I was in an open space of about 1 acre in the timber, in the presence of a company of 50 or more pro-slavery men, my deadly enemies in politics, who had assembled in this secluded and secret place to drill for the purpose of fighting anti-slavery men within a very few days. I cannot say that my hair stood on end. Under the circumstances, I didn't consider there was time to fool with hair, and knowing that the bulge counts much in all engagements, I spoke with a loud, firm, and commanding voice. "What in the devil are you fellows up to?" I was answered by the captain in command. "Where in the hell are you going?" I saw in a moment that my firmness had produced good effect, and there was no further danger. I rode up and stopped in front of the company, shook hands with the captain, told him to give the command to me, and I would drill his men and show him how Jim Lane and John Brown did it, concluding with, "If you don't have your men better trained and Jim Lane ever meets you, he will shake you up." The captain turned his men over to me, and I drew them up in a line, put them through all the cavalry movements, tangled them up, straightened them out, and told the captain he must drill better so they could get out of tight places when they met us. Then I turned to the company over to the original Captain Owens, who said, "Attention, company. This is Dr. Still, the damnedest abolition out of hell, who is not afraid of hell or high water. When you are sick, go for him. He saved my wife's life from an attack of cholera, and I know him to be successful in any place you are a mind to put him. In politics, he is our enemy. In sickness, he has proven to be our friend." And closed by saying, "Doc, go home to dinner with me, and I will go with you to see Mrs. Jones." I went with the captain to dinner, and he made his word good by going with me. From that time until the close of the pro-slavery question in 1857, I met, passed, and repassed his men without fear of molestation. So these were amazing times. And by the way, they just bushwhacked and killed the abolitionists, the pro-slavery people did, and the pro-freedom people did the same thing to the slavery people. It was that's why they called it Bloody Kansas. Now, he then joined the Kansas militia, becoming a major, and of course he was a battalion surgeon. He mainly took care of medical supplies, although we believe he was involved in a good number of operations as well. And his biggest battle was the Battle of Westport in 1864, which was the largest battle west of the Mississippi River and was called the Gettysburg of the West. More than 30,000 troops were involved. Major General Samuel Curtis defeated General Sterling Price. Still himself suffered a hernia from which he suffered the rest of his life by moving cannon. He had 2 bullets shot through his clothes. But that was the last battle that was anywhere near them. Now, in 1864, that same year, and this apparently preceded this battle. So these were horrible times. Here, there was the war. It looked like the war was moving away from them before this battle moved back west, and they participated in it. But in February of that same year, there was a spinal meningitis epidemic, and he lost 4 children. He lost 3 of them to spinal meningitis. Susan, Abraham, and an adopted child, and he lost Marcia, their baby, just a couple weeks later of pneumonia. Now, this was a devastating thing to him. And he talked about that also. I'm not going to read you many things, but I'm going to read you this a little bit, okay? War had been very merciful to me compared with this foe. War had left my family unharmed, but when the dark wings of spinal meningitis hovered over the land, it seemed to select my loved ones for its prey. The doctors came and were faithful in their attendance. Day and night they nursed and cared for my sick and administered their most trustworthy remedies, but all to no purpose. The loved ones sank lower and lower. The minister came and consoled us, surely with the men of God to invoke divine aid and men skilled in scientific research, my loved ones would be saved. Anyone might hope that between prayers and pills, the angel of death would be driven from our door. But he is a stubborn enemy, and when he has set his seal on a victim, prayers and pills will not avail. I had great faith in the honesty of my preacher and doctors then, and I have not lost that faith. God knows I believe they did what they thought was for the best. They never neglected their patients, and they dosed and added to and changed doses, hoping to hit upon that which would defeat the enemy, but it was of no avail. It was when I stood gazing upon 3 members of my family, 2 of my own children and 1 an adopted child, all dead from the disease, spinal meningitis, that I propounded to myself the serious question: in sickness, has God left man in a world of guessing? Guess what is the answer, what to give, and guess the result? And when dead, guess where he goes? I decided then that God was not a guessing God, but a God of truth, and all his works, spiritual and material, are harmonious. His law of animal life is absolute. So wise a God had certainly placed the remedy within the material house in which the spirit of life dwells. With this thought, I trimmed my sail and launched my craft as an explorer. I noticed the course of the wind, whence the winds came, and steered my vessel accordingly. Soon I saw the green islands of health all over the Sea of Reason. Okay, and so he talks about how he developed then the ideas that he put into practice with manipulation instead of using the medications, which were not working. They were inefficacious, and in fact, they were toxic. Now, shortly after that, his father died, and you might think that he was that still himself. Some people have said he was a minister, but it was his father who was the minister, still worked with him at the mission, and so some people said he was a minister, but actually he primarily worked as a doctor. When his father was going to die in 24 hours, he said to him, "Son, how does it look? Do I have very long?" And he said, "I think about 24 hours. And then he looked at his father and he said, "How do you feel about that?" And his father said, "Son, I believe I'm in the hands of a loving maker, but it's all a leap in the dark." And so still himself pondered these mysteries. He'd heard a lot of people in the Civil War say the same thing when they were about to die. It's all a leap in the dark. We know what we believe, but we'll find out, or not. So at any rate, in 1870, he still spent the winter studying with Dr. John Neal, who was a Scottish physician, and they went over many things: natural history, evolutionary biology, and medicine. Herbert Spencer was his favorite person. They studied Darwin, Thomas Huxley, Ernest Haeckel, Alfred Russel Wallace. He really liked him. He was one of the main proponents of the theory of evolution. Rudolf Virchow, the father of cellular pathology. Discoveries were being made at that time about the blood vessels having a muscular layer, the sympathetic nervous system controlling that muscular layer. So Still was studying these ideas and trying to figure out how to put them into implementation in treating the patients. He had started in the 1850s using some techniques of stretching muscles based on his own experience to help people get better. Now he started using these techniques after he lost his children and trying to figure out exactly what could he do to put the body back in harmony when it was ill. Now remember, the germ theory wasn't out at this time. That didn't come out until the time of Pasteur, which was a little bit later that he published. So he was studying these things because the medications at that time were based on tradition, not on research, and they were absolute toxins. So some of his experiences included 2 leg fractures that healed with fixation, and him doing some manipulation of the tissues to get good blood flow to the tissues. A sternal injury and heart palpitations, resolving 10 years later when he treated somebody. A woman with a rib lesion and pneumonia, he fixed the rib lesion and then she got over the pneumonia very quickly. So he was applying his new methods to every case by 1872. Now, he applied to see if he could teach these at some point in time, and I can't remember exactly when it was, at Baker University. This was just a little bit later. It was probably in the 1870s or early 1880s. Now, his family had donated the land for Baker University. He and his brother had operated a sawmill and sawed the lumber to build the building at Baker University. Here's how it looked in 1858. And so he thought surely they would be open to his teaching some new medical methods, but they absolutely would not let him do it because he was so revolutionary in his thought processes. In fact, in 1874, he had been treating some people at a picnic, and he was read out of the Methodist church that he'd been going to because he took on himself, they said, the prerogatives of Jesus Christ of laying on hands to heal people. So they read him out and said he was following the devil. Now, after that point, he moved to Macon, Missouri. His brother, Jim, had morphine addiction since the Civil War, and probably due to some injury or wound. There was rampant morphine addiction in those days. In fact, Still at one time said, when he came up with his ideas, he said that if doctors didn't stop prescribing so many things in alcohol and so much morphine, in 100 years we'd have a nation of addicts and alcoholics. But he actually made that prediction too long. We wound up with that starting pretty much in the 60s, and we had the alcoholics before then. All right, so one of the people he treated was a small boy with bloody flux, which was dysentery, probably Shigella. And he treated him. He noticed that the lumbar spine was cold and the abdomen was hot, and he manipulated the tissues on the lumbar spine. They warmed up, and the boy got better within a day. Now, children have remarkable systems that recover quickly, and Still's methods seem to work, whereas if he had gone to the other physicians, they'd have given the boy poisons to give him diarrhea, which he already had, by the way. That's what, or to purge him, make him throw up, and possibly bleed him. Now, Still had found him walking along the road. He and a friend who had been with him in his company in the Civil War were walking along. They found this boy walking. His mother had put him in a calico dress. He was walking along with nothing on under it, and blood just dripping down his legs, blood and diarrhea, and Still picked him up and carried him and discovered this about his back. So he was a man not only of courage, but of tremendous compassion. Thought nothing of just getting that all over himself to take care of that kid. In December of 1874, he moved to Kirksville. Now, he was not really going to church at the time. He associated with some of the spiritualists there. He was spiritually inclined, but no longer religious after he was read out of the church. No surprise. In fact, one time a minister came over to visit his family many years later, and the minister walked into the room. His wife liked to have the minister over. The minister walked into the room, and Still told him, he said, you know, I figure that there are about 900 cubic feet of air in this room, and it takes about 850 cubic feet of air in the room to support one person. So basically, he was telling the minister, leave the room, there's only room for one here. Now, he was a deeply spiritual man. He said he worshiped the God of nature, but he did not go for orthodoxy after he was read out of the church. Okay, but he was always interested in the mystery of life and the afterlife. Okay, in 1875, he studied magnetic healing with Paul Castor in Iowa in the early months, and then briefly advertised himself as a magnetic healer. And you might say, well, why would he call himself a magnetic healer? And the answer is, he didn't know of a name for what he was doing, putting his hands on the people, stretching out the muscles, rearranging the bones. When I say rearranging, I simply mean putting them back in their normal positions. His wife was in Kansas selling magazine subscriptions, and she moved to Kirksville later. He had gone through a period of having typhoid fever where he couldn't work for over 6 months, and it was probably close to a year, and his wife and his son, by doing odd jobs, had supported the family. That was, that was in 1876 in September. So that was a long time, and it gave him as well time to think even further. Now, he was a very inventive man. He invented smokeless combustion coal burning furnace. He also invented a plow, a harvesting machine, and a churn. He was even awarded a prize for that. So this was a brilliant, brilliant man. Okay, just because he was on the frontier and not in the established cities and universities did not mean he was not brilliant. Here's one of his early cards, Dr. A.T. Still, Lightning Bone Setter. By this time, he had heard of the bone setters and realized, okay, there was a newspaper, I think, in Kansas City that called him a bone setter. And he thought, yes, I am setting the bones back in position. So he called himself that for a brief period of time. And then check out what he said on the back of the card. Dr. Still has discovered that many diseases pronounced incurable are caused by partial or complete dislocation of the bones of the neck, chest, or limbs, which cause headache, heart disease, asthma, facial and arm paralysis, lumbago, sciatica, rheumatism, cramps of the feet and limbs, cold feet, varicose veins, piles, spasms, and so forth. This is well worth your careful attention. All the diseases above named are seldom cured until the bones at fault are adjusted. Man is fearfully and wonderfully made. That's a biblical quote. Bones set without pain or drugs. He's perhaps the only living natural bone setter in America. Enclosed 10 cents with description of disease if you wish an opinion in your case. Well, the cost for a visit or a consultation has risen since then. The interesting thing about this, when you take a look at it, he's talking here primarily of musculoskeletal medicine in almost all those conditions, isn't he? Musculoskeletal medicine and circulation, okay? So he did a lot of work with those people because the other doctors couldn't cure them. But he also treated a lot of people with acute illness because they didn't have medications that would cure them either. Okay, by the way, Pasteur was reputed to have said, and this is supposed to be a legend, nobody knows if it's true or not, Bernard, referring to the father of physiology, Claude Bernard, Bernard was right. The pathogen is nothing. The soil is everything. Now, we don't know if he actually said this, but basically, Still's idea was based on the soil, so to speak. His idea was based on the idea that if you had physiology working correctly, because the anatomy was allowing full free motion and normal function, and therefore not blocking blood flow, not blocking nerve transmission or diminishing its impact. If you had it like that, then the body was uniquely set up to invoke its own self-healing mechanisms, which we know as the immune system, and also good circulation, good respiration. So his ideas were based on supporting the body to fight the pathogens, rather than directly fighting the pathogens with toxins that they were using. And remember, they didn't have a single effective antibiotic till 1910, when Salvarsan came out for syphilis. So in the 1880s and 1890s, he studied, practiced in Kirksville, rode a medical circuit, went out to Hannibal. Some of you know where that is. That's where Mark Twain lived. Often giving free treatment while he was perfecting his methods and just taking what people would donate. He named his new form of medicine osteopathy. Now notice, this is much later that he named it. He didn't know what to call it before, but there was homeopathy, there was allopathy, because the homeopaths had named standard medical practice allopathy because they said they're using antidotes to illness. They're using something other, whereas we're using the same thing. They would take something that would cause a symptom, they would dilute it till there was actually no active ingredient left, then give the person the water from that, or the water had sugar dissolved in it and was made into sugar pills. The homeopaths did this. And then they would give them this medication, and they said, we're giving something that causes the same symptoms, so like cures like. And the other doctors, they said, are giving something opposite to the illness, and so that's So that's how the allopaths got their name. So Still actually started taking on students because by now he was about 63 in 1891, and people were very worried. They were thinking, if this man dies, there's nobody that knows how to take care of me or do what he does. What am I going to do? Okay. So they encouraged him to teach people. Several people paid him and followed him around with lessons, but it wasn't successful. They didn't seem to be able to get what he could teach. Well, William Smith, an MD, came to town selling medical supplies and surgical supplies, and he went around. Smith went around and saw the other doctors, and he'd say, "Well, how's business?" And they'd say, "Terrible." And he'd said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we got this quack in town, and so many of the people are going to this quack." And he said, "Really? Well, why are they going to?" And he said, "Well, they say they get better, but we know it's a bunch of hogwash." So Smith went over to Still's office. He wanted to see him, and they made an appointment to meet at a hotel where Smith promptly, like the good Scotsman he was, had a couple of scotches and or whiskeys. And Smith gave him a lecture about how if you had a battery and you put the wrong fluids in the battery wouldn't work, giving Smith the idea he was criticizing his drinking of alcohol. But Smith was so impressed with the way that Still was able to elaborate on anatomy that it was incredible. And he said, this man is brilliant. And he said, I want to learn to do what he's doing. So he offered to teach anatomy, since he was a qualified surgeon, if Still would teach him his methods. And Still had been convinced by now to start a school. So in 1892, in October, he started the school. Okay, and about 18 people showed up that first year. I don't know if they were all there the first day. 2 MDs were there, 5 women were in the class. Smith himself was an 1889 graduate of the University of Edinburgh. He had certificates from Edinburgh's Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Surgeons, the Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow as well. And these were European centers for medical education, especially in the English-speaking world. This is the original school as it was in place. And you can see there were other buildings around it, and that's still sitting out there. Looks like a frontier building. This is the school many years later when I first saw it. I can't remember if I took this picture. I think I might have. It's basically of course, it could be in your book as well. This is a picture of the school after it was moved and placed on campus, and they preserved it, and it became the museum. Nowadays, it's in the education building at Kirksville at the college there. Okay, so in founding the mission, the ASO, the American School of Osteopathy, he said, the object of this corporation is to establish a college of osteopathy, the design of which is to improve our present system of surgery, obstetrics, and treatment of diseases generally, and place the same on a more rational scientific basis. Okay, so that was from the college charter when they started it. Here are the original class. Here is the original class with Dr. Still. You can see, actually, he looks quite young for being 64 when the school started. Imagine, I'm 70, which means actually I've lived more than half the lifetime of the profession, more than half the year since 1892. So it amazes me that at 64, he had the energy to start up a school. But remember, it was very small scale. Nobody was telling him what to do. He had to file a minimum of paperwork. Unfortunately, they weren't able to obtain a cadaver at first. They studied with the textbooks and also the skeleton, which they named Columbus, since they were explorers. You can see the 5 women in the picture. I can't identify the 2 MDs. Smith is actually one of them. Now it's, and I think Marcus Ward was the other. So he started off with this class, and what he would do was Smith would lecture on anatomy and then Still would let them watch him in the clinic. He did not actually teach techniques at the school the very first year. Now, as I said, they had trouble getting cadavers, so I'll tell you a funny story about that. Smith went up, I don't know if it was the next year, I think actually it was a couple years later, because Smith went out and practiced. He was the first person to get a diploma as a DO, and he decided to leave the school and go out and practice. Nettie Bowles took over teaching anatomy. She was one of the women in the picture. The one down on the right, just by Still's elbow. And she wound up teaching anatomy. Smith went out and practiced, but he came back about a year later and became a faculty member again. Well, they didn't have cadavers, so they knew they might be able to get some, but not locally. So they sent Smith up because they knew somebody in Chicago who knew the night watchman at the morgue. So some money was exchanged, possibly some whiskey. They went and got cadavers in the middle of the night at a house where they were being stored that was being used as a morgue. They nailed them into essentially large crates and poured preservatives over them, poured phenol over them, and just shipped them by railroad down to Missouri. Now, they barely got out of town. They had to hide out because this theft of the cadavers was discovered. Now, remember, they weren't stealing them. They were paying the guy who was guarding them to give them to them. So it was kind of a strange operation, but they also knew that they were liable for charges, and people didn't look kindly on somebody stealing their dead relatives. So Smith and whoever went with him got on the train. They hid out, then they got on the train. They went back to Missouri. Well, this became a big scandal. They actually tracked down what happened in Chicago, and they tried to extradite Smith, and the governors of both states got involved. And the governor of Missouri did not allow Smith to be extradited, and seeing the need, he made arrangements with the legislature and with other people so that after that, the ASO was able to get cadavers. So those were some of the early adventures. Still, always told people to start by studying the bones because the bones are the framework and things attached to the bones. And it's the way things attach to the bones and get stressed or stretched or get too tight that can impede the blood flow or impede nervous circulation as well. So he said to know all of a bone in its entirety would close both ends of an eternity. Here is Still and William Smith, two MDs conspiring to improve medicine and surgery. Clearly, they were not opposed to smoking. They liked their cigars. Still said man should study and use the medicines compounded in his own body. Now, this was prescient. Remember, at the time, they were using traditional toxins, things that had just been, some of which had been found to have efficacy, like opiates. They knew you could use opiates for pain, but most of the other things were absolute poison that somebody had thought, well, you have to poison somebody to help them. In fact, they called it kill or cure medicine in many cases. I remember they even used that term in the early 1900s because they used that on my father when he was being treated for scarlet fever. They used medicine on him that they said was kill or cure. Okay. Mark Twain, by the way, was an early admirer of Still. He said, 10 years hence, no sane man will call a doctor except when the knife must be used. The educated physician will himself be an osteopath. I want osteopathy to prosper. It is common sense and scientific and cures a wider range of ailments than the doctor's methods can reach. Still actually treated his daughter, Twain's daughter, or had an osteopath who his school had produced who was treating Twain's daughter for epilepsy. They had no medications for epilepsy in those days. There was nothing to be done except try to keep the patient calm. Twain was impressed that his daughter had fewer seizures with the manipulation, probably due to less stress in the body. So also Still said they, the osteopaths, are the champions of natural law, with the idea you need to work with the body, not work by poisoning the body or using toxins on the body. Remove all obstructions, and when it is intelligently done, nature will kindly do the rest. Okay, so your job as an osteopathic physician, if you're using manipulation, is to remove the obstructions. It's to make sure things aren't so tight they don't allow blood flow or the nerves to function the right way. A few years after he started it, only 5 years after he started the school, there were something like 500 students, and they had built this beautiful new, well, it was beautiful for its time, big building, a small relic of which, a small piece of that structure survived, and I had an office in that, what was left of that building, which was incorporated into the education building of the college at Kirksville. Okay, so here are a few facts. 1896 to 1899, 13 legitimate schools of osteopathy were founded. By the way, they also had people trying to do a correspondence school for it, which obviously would not work. 1897, the American Association for the Advancement of Osteopathy was founded, renamed the AOA. 1898, the Associated Colleges of Osteopathy became ACOM. You're familiar with that from ACOMAS. 1904, the American School of Osteopathic Medicine and Surgery required 3 years of school and offered a 4th year. Remember, I told you in the 1850s and so forth, people just did 1 year. It wasn't until more like the 1890s that the medical schools started doing 2 to 3 years as a regular course. And some didn't do it even after that. Okay, dismissing the troops. One time when Still, these are just some funny stories, when Still was ready to dismiss the troops at the end, remember he was a major, at the end of their part of the Civil War, he drew a line in the dirt with his sword and said, we have a dangerous mission ahead, and I want only the people who feel that they can do this and they're brave and they can actually put up with the hardship. Many of us won't return. A lot of us won't return from this. Only the people who really serve the cause step forward over the line. So I think only about a quarter of the men stepped over the line, whereupon he announced the dangerous mission was returning home. They were dismissed. And so suddenly everybody was well. The rest had been complaining, no, I'm too sick to go. Of course, this was right after a battle too, so no wonder. Another woman who went to see him one time listened to him as he talked for a long time about what it was he did with the manipulation. And finally, she just smiles and nods and says, but isn't what you're doing really just hypnotism, a form of hypnotism? And Still just looked at her, didn't blink, and said, yes, ma'am, I set 17 hips in one day. Okay. Another time there was a drunk on the street and he said, somebody said something to him. The drunk said, well, you can't cure me of alcohol, and Still just grabbed his head with both hands and shook it and said he hoodooed him. So I don't know, he probably sounded like he was speaking in tongues or something and shaking the man's head. And the man never touched a drop of alcohol after that, he said. Another time he decided he wanted some entertainment, so he was giving a lecture to the students. He was about 75 years old, and he faked it and collapsed on the floor behind the podium. And they went forward to see, they were desperate. They went forward to see what happened. They knew he was 75 or 74, and so they went forward, and there he was, and he just started laughing at them. Okay, Blanche Still was his daughter, and she was one of the female leaders in the profession originally. Dr. Sarah Russell was one of his favorite students, and when her husband graduated a year after her and joined her practice, he went outside her office and chalked in on the sidewalk, Dr. Sarah E. Russell and her assistant. So he was definitely a person into women's rights, and he supported them all the way up to the Missouri Equal Suffrage Amendment. Hey, there's the hypnotism idea. Here are some of the people who are doing the dissection. You see a good number of women there doing it with Still looking on. Okay, some of the early osteopathic advocates were included Teddy Roosevelt and Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody definitely visited him in Kirksville. In fact, he put on his Wild West show there, and my friend Charlie Still, who was Still's grandson, was a special guest at that and wrote up an article about it when he was about 6 years old. Here's another picture of Still not too long after he would have founded the school. Here's a picture of Still with the early faculty for the school once he had it going. This was in 1899. So remember, they would have had, more than 500 students at the school by now. John Martin Littlejohn is just below Still on the left. He was dean of students for a period of time, and he ended up founding the British profession and basically much of international osteopathy. This was an early surgical sanitarium because he wasn't in the MD hospital in town. He just set up a building as a surgical sanitarium, and they used that as one of the early osteopathic hospitals for surgery. This is the KCOM Education Center. I worked, as I said, in this building. This is where they now have that log cabin, and they also have the original School of Osteopathy. They're both in the basement. Okay, well, it's about 10:56. I'm thinking now is probably a good time to take a break, so let's come back at about 11:06, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so a brief review. Hopefully this is coming through. Checking with Dr. Lynch. Not my face, huh? Okay, so let's see. Camera's on. I stop sharing. We'll try to get that back on. This would be the period of time where normally, it looks like it's back on, I think. This would be the period of time in class when the last few stragglers were coming in, of course. So it's kind of like, and by the way, I have to tell you, I can't answer questions. I'm sorry about that at this point in time, because when I'm on my computer, I don't see any of the questions. All I can see when I'm in presentation mode is the actual slides themselves. Okay, so hopefully at this point in time, you have the slides back on.
We do.
I'm asking Dr. It is? Good.
Yes.
Okay, so to do a brief review of what's going on with this, we learned about the past of Andrew Taylor Still, what was going on with him, how he wound up doing what he was doing. You know, it's something. He was only about 36 when the Civil War started. So that's something when you think of everything he'd gone through by that time in his life and everything that happened afterward. This is a man who led a very intense life, even by today's standards. Okay, so this is more or less a summary slide, but we've already covered that. And of course, I said man should study and use the medicines compounded in his own body. And we've seen the ideas about the first school. This is the first school again. Okay. Now, by 1900, there were over 700 students. So you can imagine there were over 13 schools at that point in time. Okay, including 5 of the ones that still exist. All right, now a couple more stories. Twain was actually called to be a witness, a friendly witness at a trial in New York City. There was a doctor at that trial, I believe, who challenged an osteopath who was on the stand. And I mean, it was pretty gross, the things that were said in those days. The osteopath was being questioned as to his competence, and the MD said he challenged him to, he brought in a cadaver of a boy into the courtroom and put it on the table and challenged the osteopath to do manipulation and cure that boy. And people were horrified. But the osteopath had his wits about him, and he said, I'll be happy to do that as soon as you administer a cathartic to him and have him respond to your medication. So, I mean, there were some terrible stories. There were some terrible things that happened. But Twain actually was very much a proponent and spoke his mind and said basically he stood for freedom of choice, and all Americans should have freedom of choice on what they wanted, and that's what his choice was. We also had a very famous researcher by the name of Irvin Kaur, and the only reason we got him, and he was nominated for the Nobel Prize for the research he did. His brother-in-law was Jonas Salk, who did get the Nobel Prize for Salk vaccine for polio. But Irvin Kaur was nominated for his work in which he showed that proteins travel down through the nerves to the muscles. And this is why in polio, for instance, when the nerves die, the muscles waste away, is because the proteins are no longer being transmitted down there. So this was hot research at the time. And what he was doing was demonstrating also that if you impede the nerves with musculoskeletal conditions, you get worse transmission of these proteins and other things. And so you get a less effective musculoskeletal system and a less effective physiology overall. But Core was a brilliant man. He was at Kirksville for 30 years. He was my professor and friend later, and I had him lecture for me out in California to my students out there. He only came to Kirksville because when he was young and idealistic in New York, his students had approached him and said, "Don't you stand for the brotherhood of man? Don't you think that people should all be treated as equal?" And they got him to join a political party that was affiliated with the American Communist Party. So after World War II, when he was working for the defense industry as a PhD, having graduated at Princeton, where he played second fiddle to Einstein, literally, because he played the violin and Einstein did. And when Einstein came in to play, he would yield his seat to Einstein. So that's how he said he played second fiddle. Core was an amazing, amazing man. He would never have gotten that job in Kirksville. He would have been at one of the Ivy League schools, except for the fact that he had joined that political party, and there was a big fear of the communists after World War II. So he was blacklisted for getting a job at an Ivy League school. Of course, we went through tremendous explosive growth starting after the California debacle, when California, and your dean has spoken of this, and I went to California let's see, in 1989. I was living there at the time that in 1974, at the time that the Supreme Court of California permitted osteopaths to have licenses again, osteopathic physicians. They had blocked that starting in 1961 or 62, and then they were reestablished starting in 74. At that point in time, we started rapidly expanding because when California's DOs, about 3/4 of them, got what was called a little MD degree because it wasn't recognized in any other state for $75. When that happened, we lost the largest state for the profession. And with no new DOs being produced there, what had been considered one of the most advanced schools, which then became UC Irvine's med school, MD school. So at the time that we lost that school, we only had 5 schools left. And there was a reaction in the osteopathic profession. At the same time, the civil rights movement was big. And this was considered infringement on civil rights and infringement on trade. And so a whole lot of schools were established, so that in 1983, when I started, the last school was just coming online and taking in a class of students down in Florida at Nova Southeastern. And there were now 15 colleges. And of course, that sounds small by today's standards, but in those days, it was 3 times what they had after California left the profession. Okay, so the early 20th century, state requirements for medical schools and licensure increased. After the 1910 Flexner Report, 3/4 of all medical schools and all but 7 osteopathic medical schools closed. Okay. Meanwhile, the NBOME, National Board of Osteopathic Medical Examiners, was founded in 1934. They developed the COMLEX that you'll take. Most states offered licenses to DOs in the early 20th century. Mississippi was last in 73. Expanding license rights included the rights of prescription, obstetrics, and surgery. Actually, for a long time in Illinois, they had the right to practice, but they did not have the right to prescribe. And the president of the school wrote all the prescription, or signed all the prescriptions that were given out in the clinic at the college at Chicago for a number of years, because he had an M degree as well as a DO degree. So that was I think that was in the 40s, maybe in the 50s. So specialty boards were developed. Radiology was our first specialty board in 1939. Antibiotics were developed. As I mentioned, Salvarsan was the first. It was for syphilis. And what happened was I talked to DOs who talked to DOs who saw this take place. They said they would look in the microscope under a dark field microscopy. They would see the spirochetes. Then the Salvarsan was used. They would examine the blood. The spirochetes were nowhere to be found. And this was considered a miracle. So it was the first true antibiotic that was used, that was in 1910 that came out. Okay. Now, at the same time, traditional medicine or allopathic medicine turned into modern medicine, modern Western medicine. Safer medication was developed. Many toxic medications were discarded, although right now it's still risk-benefit ratio. We use very toxic medications, especially in treatment of cancer, but also in treatment of some other things. Antiseptic technique became the norm for surgery, and then, of course, aseptic technique. Anesthesia, which first started around 1849, but wasn't commonly used at all. Even in the Civil War, they often just got the people drunk before taking off a leg if they had run out of morphine. Okay, they didn't have the anesthetic, the ether there to use. Okay, immunizations became safer because when the immunizations were originally done for smallpox, it was dangerous. It was impure. Some of the people got very ill. Some people lost limbs, and that was due to impurities in the immunization. Okay. But of course, we've developed immunizations. Now we have a totally new technique that we're using to work with COVID-19. In fact, I had my first shot on the 4th. I'll get the next one next Thursday on the 25th. I went with Pfizer. Okay. Osteopathic research took place. Burns and Cole studied the osteopathic lesion. Smith studied influenza. Whiting and Roebuck studied obstetrical outcomes and determined that osteopathic care was helpful and decreased complications and increased safety in childbirth. Okay, so as research developing pharmaceuticals improved, and remember, I mentioned salvarsan, the sulfa drugs, which were also, they were static drugs. They were not, they didn't kill the organism, they induced stasis in the organisms. And so you'll study that, the difference between the two, something that's static versus something that kills a germ. You'll see that when you do your pharmacology. So as safe pharmaceuticals were improved, DOs used them also. But what happened with the first pandemic, the first recent pandemic in 1918 to 1919 was the osteopathic treatment proved far superior to what the MDs could do in 1918 to 1919. I'll talk about that a little later when I talk about pandemics toward the end. So the sulfa drugs were developed in the 20s, but not widely available till the 1930s. And that was due to the fact that they couldn't make a lot of money with them, unfortunately. Penicillin was developed in 1927, but really didn't come into commercial production until the 1940s because they couldn't solve how to do it. And it was so valuable when it was used in World War II that if somebody on the battlefield used it and they had a shortage, when this person peed, they collected the urine and distilled out the penicillin and used the penicillin again because it was so rare. Okay, so by the 1950s, significant medications had been developed, including multiple antibiotics, insulin, heart medications. And in the 1950s, we started doing open heart surgery too. Many things happened in the early 1900s that brought us to where we are. But at the same time, think about it, 1950s, we didn't have computers, we didn't have CAT scans, we didn't have MRIs, we didn't have ultrasound. So many of the things that we use today were simply not developed. So many of the medications were still toxic or unproven. And in fact, we still have well over half the drugs in our pharmacopoeia for which we don't know the entire mechanism of action. And we use them simply because they've been found to work in some cases. And sometimes, if you actually look at the statistics and see the research, the effect is marginal. And yet a new drug is promoted with marginal effects that's not really significantly better than the ones that are out there. Okay? It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because what we would like is personalized medicine where your genome is analyzed and where a computer with AI perhaps predicts whether or not this medication will work for your genome and whether or not you'll get any side effects or any anaphylaxis, an allergic reaction. That's what we'd like, something personalized like that. Okay, and perhaps an implanted just by injection nanorobotic system with all sorts of measuring all sorts of parameters that we could use so that we didn't have to hook up so many tubes to people and do things like that. Just like we now have things where you can get a device to just read your blood through the skin to tell you your blood sugar, whereas for so many years people have been having to use needles all the time to do that. Okay, as the use of medications increased, by the way, especially around the time of World War II, osteopathic manipulative treatment decreased simply because we had so many other things that we could use. And in doing that, because most of the things that were coming into the people were not musculoskeletal conditions, many of the DOs quit using the OMT as much. Okay, also many of the post-World War II students, like many of you, were interested in becoming a physician. Many were not interested in becoming a DO. They didn't even know about DOs, okay? But they wanted to be a physician. They wanted to help people. And suddenly somebody said to them, well, wait a minute, there's this other kind of, they're a sort of an MD, but they're not MDs, they're DOs. And maybe you should look into that. And a number of these people were coming through, they were non-traditional, they were older, they had experience as a pharmacist, they had experience as a psychologist, they had experience as a research PhD, something like that. And they wanted to come in, or different people who were just older and said, well, I'd like to go to medical school. I know I'm over 30, but I'd like to do it if I could find a place to take me. So the DO schools tended to be very open and receptive to the non-traditional students as well. And a number of these non-traditional students, in fact, were not as interested in manipulation. They just wanted to be a good doctor and help people. So when they came, although they were exposed to the osteopathic philosophy and to the manipulation, they left probably impacted by the osteopathic philosophy, but less impacted by the use of the manipulation in their practices. This is understandable considering many of them went into specialties where we do not expect the specialist to use a whole lot of manipulation. I don't expect a cardiothoracic surgeon to be using manipulation. I expect him to refer his patient who has biomechanical problems due to the fact that they cut open the chest. I expect him to refer somebody to somebody who knows how to do the manipulation for that. Okay, so World War II had effects on the profession also. The DOs were not allowed to serve as physicians. A good number did serve as medics and were allowed privileges that they would not allow the other medics to use simply because the MDs were shorthanded and they let some of them do it. The GI Bill, though, when they got back, allowed veterans to attend osteopathic medical colleges with a full ride because the GI Bill was paying for people to get a college education. So you had a number of veterans coming back who went to the DO schools, and the number of private osteopathic hospitals increased following 1946 when the Hill-Burton Act came out because there were not enough hospitals in the United States. Denslow, Core, Hicks, and others at Kirksville developed the scientific basis of the osteopathic lesion, which is now called somatic dysfunction, and the sympathetic nervous system activation, the facilitated spinal segment. There was a correlation of palpatory findings in physiology and axonal transmission of proteins. The very subject for which I said Core was nominated for the Nobel Prize was also developed there. Other institutions started doing more research, but that was limited until Michigan State really got going sometime after 1971 when they went on board with the state. Now the California merger, your dean has talked about, I've talked about, over 2,000 DOs became MDs overnight, paying $65 for a new license. No other requirement, okay? And then no new osteopathic license until 1974. And what happened there was, and I knew one of these men, there were 4 men who sued the state saying that they should be allowed to practice medicine. They had DO degrees and they had been physicians in the U.S. Armed Forces during the Vietnam era, and they were being blocked from practicing their profession in California, and they said this was unconstitutional because it was allowed in all the other states. So they got that through. And As I said, later on, one of those men came and he actually helped us in Las Vegas at the school I helped found out there. All right. So you already heard the history of the service, how we actually wound up with DOs being commissioned in the service starting in 1966, which to me sounds not that long ago, and to you sounds like ancient history, no doubt. Okay. We had a college boom where between 1969 and 1981, 10 new osteopathic medical colleges were founded. Okay. And we went, now here's the thing, at the time of California, at the time of the California debacle, what wound up happening was we went down to somewhere less than 13,000 DOs in the entire country. Now, considering that there are 128,000 now, that's a huge growth in a short time since 1974, okay? All right, so late 20th century, then we started expanding even more of the colleges, getting more of them. We also had in 1983, the first U.S. Armed Forces Osteopathic Flag Officer appointed. 1996, Ronald Blank was appointed the first osteopathic Surgeon General of the U.S. Army. So again, this is like 25 years ago. This is a generation ago to you people, okay, except for a few of you, no doubt. At any rate, we had all these major changes take place with the integration of the DOs into the general medical profession. And some of the osteopathic hospitals went out of business because the DOs were now allowed to practice in basically all the hospitals. It was considered a right and in fact, a civil right. So there was to be no prejudice against them. So this was all solved a long time ago. Some of those hospitals, when they closed, though, had funds left from the sale of the hospital and formed foundations. Those foundations have been very supportive of osteopathic work. You know of William Anderson. Your dean told you about him. He was a friend of mine, is a friend of mine, still alive. An amazing man. Actually, I've been out of touch lately, and anything could have happened this year, so I hope he's still alive. But an amazing man. He sounded like a preacher when he talked. He truly preached osteopathy. He was a surgeon, and of course, he was the only convicted felon we know of who became president of the AOA, because what he was charged with was insurrection, because he fought against the unjust segregation laws in the state of Georgia. And while his trial was suspended and then going to go to another court because it was determined he could not get a fair trial in Georgia, he went up to Des Moines and did or maybe it was, I guess it was Michigan, and did a surgical residency. And then he practiced in Detroit. And I also had the privilege of working with him later, both as presidents of organizations and also because he was an associate dean at Kirksville. And had me come up and lecture at their hospital. Good man. Barbara Ross Lee, another good person who was a champion for minority rights, also the first African-American dean of a medical school, Ohio University College of Osteopathic Medicine, later the dean at NYIT, NICOM, and also the provost. She retired. She was the first DO awarded Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellowship, and then founded the AOA Health Policy Fellowship Program. She, like Bill Anderson, was a force of nature. And so is this woman, Karen Nichols, who's an internist who was dean in Chicago for many years. She was also the first female president of the American Osteopathic Association. She's currently the chair of the board of directors of the Accreditation Council of Graduate Medical Education, or ACGME. So this is just an amazing woman. I hope you get the pleasure to meet her. There's also a scholarship offered in her name for young leaders. Okay, are we back on? Okay, because it looked like something went wrong for a second. So let me see. I can no longer see my PowerPoint.
We cannot see it either.
Okay, so let me see what I can do. The thing reported to me that something had gone wrong at least. Okay, so can you see it again?
Just
No,
you
sir.
right now.
Just me. Okay, well, it's on. It should be sharing. Oh, I know. I should have called it forth a different way. Now you should be able to see it. Is that showing up?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, good. All right. John Martin Littlejohn, I mentioned to you before, and I'm not going to tell you more about him except that he founded the Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine, the hospital, and then in 1913 moved back over to the UK and founded the British School of Osteopathy in 1917. Now, I don't know that they took classes that year, or they just got the papers to where they could take the classes the next year. But he then spawned a huge number of trainings and colleges all around the world using the model of sticking with manipulation, using manipulation purely and along with nutrition, not using medications and surgery. And this was because in the UK, they were not going to grant this man, who actually did have an MD degree, as you know, they were not going to grant this man the right to train students and have them prescribe medicine. So all around the world, we had a divergent, oh yes, we are divergent, aren't we? But these people are the original divergence, okay? We've become insurgent and now we're allegiant. But these people actually had the divergent evolution of just being osteopathic practitioners, like Still had his original students doing. The exception to that is Still's original students were able to do surgery, whereas the people in the rest of the world doing osteopathic treatment are osteopaths, and they are osteopathic practitioners. Some of them say they practice osteopathic medicine. However, they do not have the right to prescribe medication. They do not have the right to do surgery. They do not have the right to do obstetrics. And so or even order blood draws, as far as I know. So as a matter of fact, these people are more like the original osteopaths, the ones who didn't do surgery. Now, like I said, the original students were permitted to do surgery if they were trained, but not all of them did. Some of them just stuck with manipulation. So this is what has spread around the world. It even came back to us where we have some people being trained in Canada because a Frenchman started a school in Canada, and they have what are called DOMP, Diploma of Osteopathy and Manual Practice, in Canada and a number of the provinces. Primarily Quebec was where that originated. And some of these people have come down in the United States, and or certain physical therapists have gone up to Canada and taken this training and come back and said, well, I'm osteopathic and I'm really an osteopath. We have to guard against that because they are not true American osteopathic physicians. And we are not like the original osteopaths who didn't do surgery. We are like the ones who did surgery and also incorporated researched medication. Okay, so I say, and I'm one of the osteopathic philosophers and historians, and I say we practice osteopathic medicine in surgery, okay, and obstetrics. We do not just practice osteopathy. So we should be aware that our philosophy is a philosophy of that's a form of the general field of medicine. Okay, so in 2004, actually, when we discovered some of these people and they started coming to us and wanting some training, the osteopathic, that started in the 90s that they started getting training. And even before that, certain Americans had gone over to and been doing some work with the people in Europe, even though the people in Europe were not licensed as physicians. So these people then started coming over in the 90s and wanted to organize. They did organize a world association. The Osteopathic International Alliance was founded under the aegis of the AOA, and it works on common issues like education, research, and promoting a relationship with the internationals who do practice a form of osteopathy along with the American osteopathic physicians. Osteopathic research networks were set up. One of the primary ones was UNTHSC. The profession funded that, also some of the foundations. They gave us many of the studies that are really, really good. There are other places, Michigan, Ohio, New England, have been some of the bastions of some of our research as well. Philadelphia has done some, certain other schools as well. I don't mean to neglect anybody, but those are the primary ones that come to mind. Oklahoma, I think, also participated. West Virginia did some. The state institutions had it a little easier because they tended to have more funding available. You can imagine it's difficult to get drug companies to pay for research specifically on manipulation, by the way, if it's going to decrease the amount of medication that's used. And so we have to rely on foundations or generous donors or the colleges to provide some seed money for that research. All right, by the early 2000s, the ACGME moved to unify all American postgraduate training to create a single accrediting body for U.S. postgraduate medical education. This transition was completed in 2020, so the residency you will do will be under the ACGME, which is combined and has numerous DOs on the board. And actually, you can go to acgme.org and you can see the picture of them. If you look at About Us, you can see the picture of the DOs on the board along with all the MDs on the board. This took place through the teens, and one of the things that they came out of with this was that the ACGME would also allow and take over the osteopathic neuromusculoskeletal medicine specialty residency programs, okay, ONMM. And so these are the ones that in which people specialize, like Dr. Lynch did, in doing a residency that uses a great deal of the manipulation. You learn other things as well. You're constantly involved in medicine and surgery and obstetrics, but you rotate through those and you're using a lot of the manipulation with the patients to help them out, as well as taking the other general ones so that you know what you're doing medically in surgery. We don't want anybody going out there and being dangerous. Okay, so also osteopathic recognition is one of the things you can get at your ACGME program. It requires you to do a little extra work, but it keeps your osteopathic awareness there, some hands-on training and so forth. These programs are currently under development. Some of them have suffered this year due to the fact that we're trying to limit patient contact in many ways and training contact because of the danger of COVID-19. Okay. The more things change, the more they stay the same. First, do no harm, said Hippocrates. Well, risk-benefit ratio took that over a long time ago, and in fact, during his lifetime, when they were using plenty of toxins on people, thinking, well, it can't hurt at this point, and it may help. Okay, and that's in fact continued throughout all the study of medicine. Life is short, art long, opportunity fleeting, experience treacherous, judgment difficult. Get used to that. Truer words were never spoken about the practice of medicine. Okay, at the end of my career and being retired now, there are so many things I would like to study and learn if I had the energy and the mental focus and acuity to be able to do so. I can come up with the words now, but I have to say that my memory for small, fine details and the amount that you're supposed to get where, you know, we essentially hook up a fire hose to your mouth and then 6 weeks later ask you to vomit it out and see if you retained anything. I couldn't take that at this point in time. So medicine in the 1800s, again, this is a little review. They had limited sanitation. Vaccination had just started in the last decade, I think, of the 1700s. No antibiotics, no anti-inflammatories, no steroids, no anesthesia, no antiseptics, no aseptic technique. They had opiates, they had colchicine, which was used for pain and gout. Water treatments, drink water, take a shower, take a bath, sweat it out, sauna. They had bloodletting, which they used all the time. George Washington was essentially bled to death. I'd tell you that story, but that'd be for another time. Toxic mercuric compounds. They poisoned people with mercury all the time. In fact, they used to joke even about the people, before they came out with Salvarsan for syphilis, they used to joke and say, an evening with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Okay, organic food they had, but they didn't have refrigeration, so lots of people died of food poisoning. Okay, all right, but we started out divergent. Okay, and you know, if you've ever wondered what Still looked like, here he was. He started his new program because of the loss of his children and his frustration with what had happened and the fact that medications weren't working then. Surgery was no good then. And he looked for something better. So he was divergent. He left the mainstream where tradition ruled rather than science. If this will come through, this is what he looked like. This is in his 86th year, so he's 85. Is this coming through?
We can see.
Yes, sir.
Good. Now watch what he does. He's going to use the arm as a long lever. He's got his hand focused on the back, on the rib, and then he's going to check the ribs afterward. And we teach this same technique now, but it was lost until the 1990s when a wonderful man by the name of Richard Van Buskirk, who was a PhD neuroscientist who became a DO and did a year's surgical residency before doing family medicine, redeveloped it, went back to the books, researched them, figured out what he was doing, and now you can learn Still technique like he did it. Okay, let's see. Nature. This is what Still was about. He said the body, he didn't say these exact words, but he said the body has inherent wisdom. The body knows what it's doing. We would say today it's got an operating system that works well to survive and reproduce. That's what evolution's about. Survive, reproduce, keep the race going. Okay? Irvin Kaur, my professor and friend, said the body is so complex that it's not surprising we get sick. It's amazing that we stay well. I'm sure Dr. Pryor would absolutely agree with me, and also your immunologist and everybody else there that deals with medicine. So, first, do no harm. Support the patient. Supportive measures. Okay? When we use manipulation, we're using it to remove obstacles to the body supplying its own health, generating its own health, fighting illness on its own. Can it do it all the time? No, it can't. But we need to work with the body to help it do it the best it can. So don't fight nature, work with the body. You wanted to become a physician. You are inventing yourself as a physician. Now, why am I saying this? I was originally going to call this lecture The Art of Reinvention, because Still reinvented medicine. And so did the other people back at his time. They reinvented medicine, and instead of using traditional medications, developed things scientifically. They developed diagnostic things. They developed the x-rays. They developed the CAT scans, the MRI. They developed ultrasound. They developed so many different medications that are now researched. We're not allowed to use them unless they're researched. Okay, so all of medicine was reinventing itself, and Still was part of that. And Still's reinvention produced 128,000 physicians in this country. That's nothing to sneeze at, okay? My comments are based on the fact that I've been alive for more than half of the profession, okay? This is a young profession. It's a young, divergent profession that's now pretty much a side stream that's right there with it. And the stuff that we went and diverged to do, we're bringing back to the mainstream as well. And why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because essentially we gained some things by doing this. A holistic philosophy and some unique treatment, and a focus on attaining and maintaining health rather than merely fighting disease. And that's one of the things you need to do. Still said, seek health in your patients. Any fool can find disease. Well, that doesn't mean you don't look for disease and diagnosis. It means go beyond that. Don't just diagnose and don't just use things. Find the cause and seek health. Try to bring the patient back to health. Of course, that's all of our goal, but too often it seems like it's a search and destroy mission on disease. It's not a search and destroy mission where you take out the enemy in a video game or something like that. It's nothing like that. It's like, no, you want them back to where they're healthy, not just where you eliminated the disease that your specialty treats. Okay. We came up first with the idea of the osteopathic lesion. That's what Still called it. Now we call it somatic dysfunction. How do we get somatic dysfunction? Essentially, when parts of the musculoskeletal system do not return to neutral after an action, they remain dysfunctional. That limits or restricts motion. That creates tight tissue. Then the bones don't have their appositional surfaces allowing free motion either. So we have anatomical discord and we get physiologic discord as a result. The system doesn't work as well. We want to restore it so there's full range of motion, free blood flow as it should be. Okay, so manipulation can be used to alter physiology by improving function. This has its place in the medicarium, and this is our unique kind. This is also why they're allowing MDs in the ACGME program to also go for osteopathic recognition, because there are a number of them that want to use it. So we look at what are some of our contributions and emphases that are, as we diverged and came back and the mainstream moved over toward us, as the two streams reconverged, what influences did we have? Well, recovery and wellness for people who were not helped by traditional Western methods, because at the start of this profession, there wasn't a physical therapy profession. There wasn't an occupational therapy profession. There wasn't good surgery. There weren't good medications. And so we were able to help, our profession was able to help many people that the current state of the art could not help. And it still can help people. I didn't go to Dr. Lynch just because he was my former student. I went to him because he knew things the other doctors didn't know that could help my musculoskeletal condition and give me less pain and give me more function. I wanted the function. Okay, so we developed unique diagnosis and treatment, a body, mind, spirit approach, which goes back all the way to Hippocrates, but which was lost as people chased lab values in the 20th centuries. Better listening, a high touch approach, emphasis on the primary care model, and an open pathway for non-traditional students. Those were some of our strengths. Now let's talk about the pandemics just a bit, okay? The 1918-19 Spanish influenza pandemic, H1N1, influenza A, probably started in China. For a while, they thought it started in Kansas, but more recent tracking, and I think I have the National Geographic article there, yes. I have a couple articles there. I won't post them now. I'll let you look them up when you get this PowerPoint, but they talk to you about the origins of this, and it was influenza. Doctors didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know it was a virus. The medical approach included what Sir William Osler recommended was strychnine to stimulate the heart. That's a deadly poison. Okay. He himself died after surgery for an empyema after suffering pneumonia after the flu, which was what killed most of the people. Pneumonia after the flu killed most of the people that had it. 2018 to 2021, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. Okay, China was the origin. Again, the virus, SARS corona, what doctors think. We know it's a virus. We know what the virus looks like. We know some ways to deal with it. We have better supportive methods. We have better outcomes. The osteopathic approach, well, here was the interesting thing. The osteopaths were so much more effective than the MDs in the original pandemic. Take a look at this. It killed more people than World War I, 50 or possibly up to 100 million worldwide. 675,000 of 103 million Americans, that should be. So I'll fix that before you get it. But it's 675,000 of the population of 103 million Americans died of the flu or its sequelae. Now, normally we have somewhere between 36 and 64,000 a year dying in the United States now. It probably was more back then. Okay, but the conventional medical care in the flu had a much higher death rate And with uncomplicated cases, the DOs had a rate about 10 times better for treatment, and 3 times as many patients who got pneumonia died if they saw an MD as died who saw a DO. Okay, we had about a quarter of the fatalities. Okay, and why is this? The MDs were basically poisoning them and had nothing to offer. Okay, the DOs actually had something to help the body function better. Now, that's not to say that's what we would do now with the treatment. You can't do manipulation that a ventilator can do. A ventilator is mechanical manipulation. Sometimes we need mechanical manipulation. Sometimes we need manipulation by cold steel. Sometimes we need manipulation of the physiology by medications, obviously. You saw how much confusion there was with all that about hydroxychloroquine and everything, all the controversy on treatments. Thank God nobody was actually injecting bleach. But at any rate, Sir William Osler was one of the founders of Johns Hopkins, and as I said, he died of it. Strychnine was one of the things he recommended. I put in a link you'll be able to check later where you can look at what methods were being used by the pharmacists and the doctors back then, the strange things they were using. Also, the osteopathic approaches are described in a JAOA article from, I think, 2012 or 2013. So the medications in Still's time were toxic and called materia medica, based on tradition, kill or cure. They had a very few reliable ones. 21st century, it's called pharmacology. We've used Paul Ehrlich's idea of a charmed bullet, where you have something, if you want an antibiotic, that will kill the organism without killing the patient. At the same time, we've developed scientific methods of looking at physiology and looking at different compounds and trying to trace and see how they affect physiology and what the outcomes are. Toxicity is addressed through risk-benefit ratio, so everything's a two-edged sword. Okay, so I want to say this. Injury often involves tissue damage and maladaptive set points for muscle length and tension, which limit motion and cause pain. Okay, I'd like to have a nanorobotic system with sensors that just picks up everything and gives me something an AI can analyze and tell us what to do. Okay, instead, we have to rely on our minds and our hands if we're going to do the manipulation. I'm fascinated by tissue regeneration and reconstruction. I like the idea of nanorobotic tissue reconstruction as long as my nanorobots don't get a virus. God knows that would be dangerous. Okay, but if we could regenerate tissue naturally instead of with a cicatrice, with a scar that impeded the motion in the tissue, we'd be much healthier. Okay, now what do we currently have in medical approaches for somatic dysfunction? Well, we have the medications, the opioids, the anti-inflammatories, muscle relaxants, central acting agents, certain antidepressants, anticonvulsants. By the way, I take an anti-inflammatory every day because of my osteoarthritis. Manipulation doesn't cure osteoarthritis. Okay, but manipulation sure helps the somatic dysfunction that accompanies it. Okay, we have nothing in the field of medicine today other than injections that will alter the length and tension of a specific muscle or reset the joint apposition, the surfaces of the joints, to allow normal physiologic range of motion. That is what OMT does, okay? It's non-invasive too. It reestablishes the body's efficiency and decreases the illness or the impact of injuries once tissue is healed. So that's what we have to contribute to the mainstream. Okay, we've gone from clay tablets and the abacus to books, digital records, computers. We have tons of information. We can data mine. We actually need to be using the artificial intelligence more to figure out things because there's so much data you can't figure it out. When I was a boy, they said, we're going to need people who are synthesists, people who can put together the information so it's utilizable, because so much information will be available that we won't be able to use because we're not putting it together. Well, the AIs look like they'll put it together. Of course, that's a bit worrisome if you talk to Elon Musk, isn't it? Where he talks about the technological singularity taking place possibly in 5 years, where the computers then become smarter than we are in directing their own evolution. That sounds like Terminator, doesn't it? So let's hope it doesn't happen. He says he's scared to death of it. So am I. But it's not going to stop just because we have some ideas. So the medical establishment only has a few things, and they include injections for dealing with this. But in primary care and in all care, there are a large number of neuromuscular injuries or conditions for which surgery is inappropriate or unsuccessful and medication is ineffective. Okay, so that's what we need to use the manipulation on. Now, Still didn't know how the medical field would evolve, or he'd have probably been more interested. He wasn't just using this stuff for neuromusculoskeletal conditions, but for acute illnesses. Okay, the medical establishment rejected it because it didn't follow their model. Now they're open-minded and they're, show me, okay, like the people from Missouri. Show me, if it works, we'll use it. Okay, so subsequently in the 1900s, there was a great deal of development of the techniques. The Still technique was redeveloped by Richard Van Buskirk, also Stan Shiowitz. I should have put him in there for facilitated positional release. Articulatory and HVLA came from Still's students. Osteopathy in the cranial field, or cranial osteopathy, from W.G. Sutherland. Muscle energy from Fred Mitchell Sr. Strain counterstrain from Lawrence Jones. Myofascial release from Tony Ciela, Robert Ward, John Peckham, and Neidner preceded them. Okay, now here's what you need to do. All right, you're engaged in a massive struggle to come through and master all this information and be able to utilize it practically. You need to take care of yourself. Practice on yourself as a patient in seeking health in your patient. That's the way of Still. That is the osteopathic way. Seek health in your patient, and in this case, you are the patient. We need you to have personal resilience to get through med school, residency, and the stress of practice. You've certainly seen that on TV with all the people on the front line. Okay? I always like that Japanese proverb, fall down 7 times, get up 8. But it seems like that person had a math problem, because if you fall down 7 times, you can only get up 7 times. How are you supposed to get up the 8th time? Unless you were already lying down at the beginning, okay? So you need to build support systems to help you get up those times. You need to make a plan, okay? Diet, exercise, rest, pay attention to those. Meditation decreases the sympathetic nervous system actions on the body. Reflection helps you find meaning in medicine. Try to write 3 sentences every day to find meaning in your life. Burnout? Select the top priority for the day. Just try to get that done. The other things will generally fall in line, unless you're really bad off and need time off. There are times when that occurs. Are you sad or down? Spend 12 seconds thinking of a positive memory. There's research on this that says this is helpful in mild depression. At night, list 10 things you're grateful for before bed. There's research on gratitude meditation. Build in times for rest and regeneration. Accept right now that you're in a state of temporary imbalance, but do not accidentally let it become permanent. Balance is a personal thing. Some people need more work and less play. Some people need more play and less work. Okay? Reinvent yourself. That's what you're doing right now. You're inventing yourself as a physician, and every day you reinvent yourself in some way. Get used to the idea. Don't be afraid of personal reinvention and personal invention. Moment to moment, or greater magnitude. So, 21st century osteopathic medicine. Knowing the past, looking at the present, where do we go from here? History is valuable just so we can use that knowledge and attempt to wisely shape the future. It's gone. Let's benefit from the knowledge so we shape the future the way we should. We have a prediction that the use of mechanical forces to help the body optimize its functional level and decrease pain, pioneered by the osteopathic medical profession, will be further integrated into the medical mainstream. Fortunately for you, you young DOs can be in any specialty and can offer unique insights based on that osteopathic philosophy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thank you for sharing this time with us and your knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck. Good luck.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.